Are you interested in angels, demons, ghosts, spirits, and monsters? Are you curious about their origins, tales, and influence upon history and on the present day? If so, then sit back, relax, and welcome to Southern Demonology, the podcast that explores all of this and more. Hello all, and welcome back to another episode of Southern Demonology. As always, I am your friendly neighborhood ancient demonologist, JJ. And today, we are finally beginning a topic that has been requested for a very long time. One that I have circled around, brushed up against, and occasionally threatened to do like an over-caffeinated academic raccoon digging through a trash can full of old grimoires. We are going to begin a series on named demons. Now, before anyone gets too excited and starts sharpening pitchforks, lighting black candles, or deciding that this is the perfect time to ask me whether their cousin sleep paralysis shadow man is actually one of the 72 spirits of Solomon, let me say this right at the outset. This episode is not about conjuring. It is not about summoning. It is not about finding the quote, true name of some infernal being so that you can impress your weird friend from high school who bought one occult paperback and now thinks that he is the fleshy incarnation of Lord Nurgle. No, this episode is about context and how to think. Because if we're going to spend any length of time talking about named demons, then we need a foundation first. We need to talk about what these names are, where they come from, what kind of names they are, how they travel from one culture to another, and perhaps most important of all, how much stock we should put into them. And that last question matters because names carry power in the human imagination, and they always have. A name can turn a vague fear into a face. A name makes a thing feel knowable. It makes chaos feel categorized, and it lets us believe that if we can label something, we have somehow mastered it. And dear Lord, if humanity loves anything, it is the illusion of mastery. Now, before we get going, let me put my standard disclaimer right here where it belongs. I am not claiming to be 100% correct on everything that follows. When we are dealing with the ancient world, with fragmentary text, with shifting languages, translations, oral traditions, scribal transmission, folk religion, and later demonologies piled on top of earlier ones, like a very cursed layer cake. Certainty is a luxury we simply do not possess. So what I am giving you here is not infallibility. What I am giving you is a method. And honestly, for this topic, the method is more important than any single answer. The first thing we need to do is dismantle a modern assumption. And that assumption is this: if a demon has a name, then that name must be original, stable, ancient, and spiritually precise. That does sound reasonable. It is also in many cases horribly wrong, because when people hear demon names, they tend to imagine a kind of infernal census bureau. They think somewhere in the depths of the abyss, there's a filing cabinet with exact spellings, proper titles, domains, ranks, maybe a little office mug that says world's best demon. All we have to do is find the right grimoire and suddenly the whole thing becomes neat and orderly. But that is not how history works, and it certainly is not how language works. We have to remember, a name can be a title. A title can become a proper name. A god's name can become a demon's name. A place name can preserve the memory of a deity long after the worship is gone. An epitaph can be misunderstood by a later translator and treated as a distinct being. A scribal corruption can spawn a whole new tradition. A foreign name can be filtered through Hebrew, then Greek, then Latin, then a medieval vernacular, and by the time it reaches us, it may sound ancient and authoritative, while actually being a game of theological telephone. And that is why this series needs an introductory episode, because I do not want us treating names as if they've dropped from the heavens, engraved on stone tablets, labeled official infernal registry. They did not. Now, when people talk about demon names, they often throw around terms like Semitic, Greek, Latin, Persian, sometimes Egyptian, and they use those labels as if they are self-explanatory. So let's slow down and unpack that just a little bit. When I say a name is Semitic, I am referring to a family of languages. That includes languages like Hebrew, Ethiopic, Aramaic, Phoenician, Ugaritic, Akkadian, Arabic, and several others. These languages are related, though not identical, and they often share roots, patterns, and naming conventions. There are also subgroups such as Hebrew and Aramaic, which are Northwest Semitic, and Ethiopic, which is Southeast. This matters because if you are looking at a name that is supposedly from a Phoenician source, but it has obvious Latin elements, then somebody, somewhere, has taken a very wrong turn. And yes, I am looking directly at every movie, paperback, or internet thread that wants to tell you that a suspiciously Latin-sounding demon name comes from a quote-unquote ancient Phoenician dialect. Phoenician is a Semitic language. Latin is not. Those are not the same thing. They're not cousins. They're not even next-door neighbors. And they most certainly are not even shopping in the same theological grocery store. Likewise, Greek names have their own structures, sounds, and contexts. Latin names do too. And when a demonology text gives you a long list of names that are overwhelmingly Greek or Latin, that should immediately tell you something important. You are often not dealing with primordial infernal self-identification. You are dealing with the linguistic and theological world of the people who recorded the tradition. And that is a massive difference. Because if a monk in late antiquity, or a medieval cleric, or a Renaissance magician writes down a demon's name in Greek or Latin, that tells you, at minimum, that the tradition has already passed through Greek or Latin speaking hands. It tells you about reception history. It tells you about the culture doing the naming. It does not automatically tell you what the entity, if such an entity exists, really calls itself. That distinction is where people get into trouble. Or, let me put it another way. If I go to Japan and every person there calls me JJ, that does not mean that my soul is ontologically and eternally coded in the cosmos as JJ in every language and every age and in every spiritual register. That means that it is the name I am known in that context. Names are relational, and that is just for humans. For spirits, things get murkier, not clearer. Now, ancient people absolutely did believe that names mattered. The biblical world cared about names. The broader ancient Near East cared about names. Magic, liturgy, exorcism, invocation, cursing tablets, protective formula, all of these could place enormous weight on speaking or knowing the correct name. But correct did not always mean what modern people think it does. Sometimes it meant ritually effective. Sometimes it meant traditionally received. Sometimes it meant recognizable within a given cultic or linguistic setting. Sometimes it meant a title that captured function rather than essence. And that last point is a big one. Many names that later generations treat as if they were proper names may have begun as descriptions. The accuser, the adversary, the destroyer, lord of this or that, spirit of such and such place, prince, watcher, burning one. You can see how easily that happens, right? A role becomes a label, and that label hardens into an identity. Eventually, people forget that it may have started off as a job description. That is not a bug in history. That is history. Another thing we need to untangle is the difference between names that come from a hostile polemic and names that come from devotional use. This is especially important with ancient gods who later become demons. One of the most common pathways for demon names is not that a demon wandered into human history and announced itself like a wrestler entered the ring. Rather, a god from one religious system gets recast by a rival religious system as false, polluted, subordinate, hostile, or outright demonic. It happens all over the place. Sometimes it may be subtle or aggressive, or it could be theological appropriation. And sometimes it's just straight up cultural mudslinging. An obvious example of this is Zoroastrianism and Hinduism. The two religions both started from the same Proto-Iranian people and competed fiercely with one another, to the point where the gods of one became the demons of another. And that matters because it means that not every demon name began as an infernal name. Sometimes a demonic name is really a former god name, and sometimes it's a title misread as a name. Sometimes it could be a scribal issue, and other times it can be folklore. And sometimes, yes, it is probably little more than the theological equivalent of people on the internet connecting red strings between thumbtacks and declaring victory. Now, let's talk about the broad categories of names that you are likely to encounter in a series like this. First, you have names with clear ancient Near Eastern or Semitic roots. These are often the most historically layered because they come from a world in which Israel, Judah, Phoenicia, Syria, Mesopotamia, and surrounding cultures were in constant contact, conflict, exchange, and overlap. These names may belong originally to deities, local spirits, plague figures, wilderness beings, underworld entities, or cosmic opponents. Sometimes they are clearly part of a known pantheon. Sometimes they are more obscure. Other times they survive only in one or two texts and later become far more important than their source material would justify. Second, you have Greek names and categories, and this can happen because Greek became a major language of the Eastern Mediterranean, because Jewish texts circulated in Greek, because early Christianity developed heavily in Greek, and because later interpretations absorbed Greek philosophical and religious vocabulary. So when Greek terms appear, they may reflect translation choices, conceptual overlap, or later systemization. A third is you have Latin names. A Latin demonic name often tells you that you are in the latter phase of transmission. Not always, but often. Latin signals the Western Christian world, medieval church tradition, scholastic demonology, grimoire literature, and later occult compilation. It can still preserve older material, absolutely, but, and this is important, it is already filtered. A fourth is you have hybrid names, garbled names, transliterated names, and frankly, names that look like they lost a knife fight to 3 languages and a copyist. These are some of the trickiest because they may preserve something old, or they may simply be corrupted forms that later readers turned into entities of their own. That is one reason why pronunciation debates often become absurd. People will argue with the confidence of crusading accountants on whether a demon's name is pronounced one way or the other, and meanwhile the manuscript is sitting here in the corner saying, "Friends, I barely know what I am anymore." But before I go on, let me interrupt my own little diatribe to point out that Azazel is indeed pronounced Azazel and not Azazel. Anyway, back on topic. I do not bring up these garbled names to mock scholarship. Far from it. Scholarship is exactly what helps us see how unstable these traditions can be. The problem is pseudo-scholarship, where someone takes instability and markets it as certainty. Now, let me address the question underneath this whole episode. How much stock should people put into demonic names? My answer is probably going to frustrate both extremes. You shouldn't put zero stock in them, nor should you do the opposite and put absolute stock in them either. On the one hand, names matter historically, culturally, religiously, and sometimes spiritually. They can reveal lineage, influence, theological memory, and patterns of belief. They can show how one culture viewed another. They can preserve traces of old religions inside later texts. They can illuminate exorcistic traditions. And they can help us understand why latter demonologies look the way they do. So no, names are not meaningless. On the other hand, names are not magic cheat codes that automatically unlock the essence of a spirit. A list of names is not the same thing as understanding. Memorizing a demonological catalog does not make someone a specialist any more than learning all the dinosaur names turns me into a paleontologist. Though I would love to be a phenomenal one if spite and enthusiasm counted as credentials. And spiritually, this is where I want to be very careful. There is a strain of modern fascination with the demonic that treats names almost like collectibles. People want the exotic. They desire the forbidden, and they have to have an aesthetic of danger with as little actual danger as possible. So when they read lists of infernal names the way other people read fantasy lore or football stats, that is a terrible posture. Not because every ancient name is automatically cursed or spoken aloud. I do not think reality is that cartoonish, but because the habit itself is disordered. It treats the subject as entertainment, as a power fantasy, as esoteric vanity. And that is not a healthy way to approach the hostile unknown. A better posture is sober curiosity. Learn the names, study the history, understand the textual transmission, recognize the layers, but do not romanticize the thing behind the label. Now let me bring one more angle in that is deeply important. People often assume that older equals truer, and that assumption causes all kinds of havoc. If they connect a modern story to a more ancient one, then suddenly the modern story feels validated. That is one reason why folk etymology spread so easily. People hear two vaguely similar names and decide they must be the same because one sounds older and therefore more legitimate. This is exactly what has happened to the idiotic story of Zozo, wherein people attempt to give it more credibility because it sounds a little, if you stab yourself in each eardrum and ignore everything taught about Semitic philology, like Pazuzu, or even around creepypasta of black-eyed children, namely because they hearken to roles around vampires. But history is not an escalator to certainty. Sometimes later traditions preserve old truths. Sometimes they preserve old mistakes. They can invent new mistakes and then age them like bad cheese. So whenever we encounter a demonic name, one of the first questions should be, what is the earliest secure attestation? Not what the people on TikTok say. Not what some sensational paperback claims. Not what a horror movie said in a dramatic whisper while a cello played in the background. What is the earliest secure attestation? And then right after that, in what language? In what text? In what context? As a god, as a spirit, as an epitaph, as a place name, as a hostile reinterpretation, as a transliteration? That is how you avoid nonsense. Now, something else that deserves mention here is the issue of hierarchy. People love hierarchies of hell. They love ranking systems, kings, dukes, presidents, princes, marquises, counts, commanders, chief of staffs, vice presidents of regional temptation, whatever. I get the appeal. Human beings are bureaucratic creatures. We would organize chaos into a spreadsheet if given a chance. But infernal hierarchies, as popularly imagined, are often late constructions. They reflect the social and political models of the cultures that produce them. Feudal cultures imagine feudal hells. Imperial cultures imagine imperial hells. Administrative minds produce administrative demonologies. That does not make them useless, but it does make them revealing. The question is, revealing of what? Of spiritual reality in a 101 sense? Sometimes maybe, but more reliably, they reveal the imagination of the age that made them. And the names inside those systems often behave the same way. This is why, in the episodes that follow, I want to ask not just, who is this demon supposed to be? But also, who needed this demon to be that? Those are two very different questions. Now, let's make this practical. How should listeners think about named demons going forward in this series? I would suggest 7 principles. First, treat every name as data before doctrine. A name is a clue, a lead, a witness. It is not automatically the verdict. Second, ask the language family we are dealing with. Does the claimed origin match the actual structure of the name? Is it Semitic, Greek, Latin, Persian, something else, or too mangled to be certain? Third, distinguish between original context and later reception. Was this being a god before it was a demon? Was it a title before it was personified? Was it minor in its original setting but inflated later? Fourth, beware of folk etymologies. Similarity in sound is not proof of identity. It's often proof that humans are pattern-hungry little goblins. Fifth, do not confuse ritual seriousness with historical certainty. A magical or exorcistic text may treat a name as powerful and fixed. That tells us a great deal about the ritual world of the practitioner. It does not settle the historical question once and for all. 6. Avoid both cynicism and credulity. Do not sneer at every tradition. People across centuries were not idiots. But do not bow before every list of names either, especially when it is severed from context. And 7. Remember that from a spiritual safety perspective, fascination is rarely neutral. The enemy does not need you to worship in order to waste your attention. Distraction, obsession, vanity, fear, and misplaced confidence do a whole lot of work all by themselves. I want to touch briefly on one issue that usually comes up whenever demonic names are discussed in a Christian context, and that is the idea that naming gives power over the named. There is some deep, old logic behind that. We see versions of it in religion, magic, folklore, and literature all over the world. To know the name is to identify, to bind, to call, to command, or to distinguish. And because of that, there is often great pressure to identify a specific entity behind a specific manifestations. Sometimes that is understandable. Human beings want specifics. A dark presence is unnerving. It was a named being feels more concrete, but that concreteness can be false comfort. If a name is unstable, borrowed, title-like, culturally transmitted, translated, or polematically reassigned, then insisting on exact demonological identification can produce more illusion than clarity. So, in future episodes, if I occasionally say, this may be the origin of the name, or this later tradition identifies the being this way, or this is probably a reinterpretation rather than an original entity, that is not me being evasive. That is me being nothing but honest, and honesty is painfully short in this field. Where does all of this leave us for the series ahead? Well, it gives us a much richer landscape. Instead of asking only, what demon is this? Or what movies did it appear in? We can also ask, what did this name mean in its own language? What religious world did it come from? Was it always demonic, or did it become demonic later? How did Jewish, Christian, or other traditions reinterpret it? What did medieval writers do with it? What did modern occultism do with it? How about pop culture? Did they mangle it beyond recognition? And yes, we will absolutely be talking about that last one, because some of these names have been done so dirty by movies, video games, internet lore, and bargain bin occult publishing that I almost feel bad for them. Almost. Let me wrap this up by saying something that may sound paradoxical, but I think it is the right note on which to end. Named demons are worth studying precisely because their names are unstable. If they were simple, there would be far less to learn. Their names show us the movement of religion through time. They show us conquest, translation, memory, fear, theology, rivalry, and imagination. They show us how one people's God becomes another people's demon. They show us how languages carry old worlds inside them. They show us how the Bible both inherits and transforms the religious universe around it. And they show us how later generations keep trying over and over again to systematize the hostile unknown. So, how much stock should people put into demon names? Enough to take them seriously, not enough to worship, but enough to study them carefully. Not enough to build castles of dogma on shaky philology, but enough to respect that names can carry history and possibly spiritual significance. Not enough to imagine that every list on the internet is a key to hell, and perhaps most importantly of all, enough to remain humble, because humility is the beginning of wisdom in this and every other field. The moment someone tells you that they have the demonic world fully mapped, categorized, and named with absolute certainty, do yourself a favor. Back away slowly, preferably while making the sign of the cross, or at least while unsubscribing from their newsletter or Substack. In the next part of the series, we're going to begin looking at individual named demons and testing everything that I have laid out today against specific cases. We will ask where the name comes from, what language it belongs to, whether it started as a deity, whether the popular story is nonsense, and what, if anything, we can responsibly say about it now. And trust me, some of those answers are going to be much stranger than people expect. As always, thank you for listening to Southern Demonology. Stay safe out there.
Thank you for listening to Southern Demonology. Find us online at southerndemonology.com, where you can find all of our social links, including YouTube, TikTok, and Patreon, in addition to listen to episodes and read their transcripts. Also, if you have a moment, please rate this podcast and share it with friends, as nothing can help us grow more.